Good morning. This is Ernie Wheeler. I work for the Vermont Agency of Education in the special ed wing. I've been there now for 17 years. 19 years prior to that, I was a school psychologist in upstate New York, and 17 years ago, I came home to work for the agency. Today, we're talking about adverse effect, which is always an interesting question in Vermont. So why did we need to talk about adverse effect? One of the things that I certainly have gotten a lot of phone calls over my 17 years is from districts asking me questions about how to do adverse effect. Historically, adverse effect interpretation has been fairly inconsistent and confusing to many in Vermont, especially those who weren't educated here. So new staff moving into Vermont and certainly new parents moving into Vermont. Because Vermont has a different way of doing adverse effect than many states in the nation do. It really started the discussion about doing training for adverse effect, a new training for adverse effect, came from the Vermont Special Education Advisory Council. They discussed it as one of the unmet needs within Vermont. And from that, we developed a state committee of stakeholders to collaborate and clarify the interpretation and set up some new adverse effect guidance for staffs in Vermont. This is the adverse effect stakeholders group that was formed. The first three lines, Sherry Brunel from the Disability Law Project, Karen Price and Nancy Richards from Vermont Family Network, and Joy Wilcox, are all members of the Vermont Special Education Advisory Council. Shannon Newell was a school psychologist down at Castleton University. Donna Ray Dawson is a special ed director in a nearby district. Cindy Moran, myself, Laura Baker, and Tanya Rutkowski are all people from the Agency of Education. In the federal regulations, in most cases, the federal regulations definitions include, for the disability categories, the phrase, and adversely affects a child's educational performance. So that's where the term adverse effect comes from in terms of making a determination that a student is eligible for special education. In Vermont, in the 1990s, Vermont legislature passed a set of regulations that defined adverse effect as being significantly below grade norms, that a student's educational performance was at least below the 15th percentile or a minus 1.0 standard deviation below the mean of a test, as measured by at least 3 of the following 6 measures of school performance. Those being individually administered nationally normed tests, group administered nationally normed tests, grades or proficiency-based measures, curriculum-based measures, criterion reference group administered assessments, and other information, such as student work samples, language samples, or portfolios. The basic skill areas that we have to choose from are the following 9: oral expression, listening comprehension, written expression, basic reading skills, decoding, reading comprehension, understanding of what's being read by the student, mathematics calculation, computations, mathematic reasoning, which are the word problems, motor skills, and reading fluency, which currently is only for students being evaluated for specific learning disabilities. The intent of the rule established in Vermont was to establish a greater consistency across the state in determining adverse effect, as well as assisting the evaluation planning team's decision regarding the student's need for special education services. What we found was it did add to a greater consistency around the state. We also saw 2 things coming into play. Evidence of adverse effect dealt almost exclusively with academic performance, at the exclusion of functional performance. And eligibility varied from school to school based on the availability of general education resources and supports within the school. That has to do with the need for special education. Indeed, if there were supports available within the general ed system within the school, the student wouldn't qualify for special education because their needs could be met through standard supports available within the school. So the change for us from the Vermont Agency of Education was to emphasize and support an evaluation planning team's additional consideration of functional skill deficits in the determination of adverse effect, not just the academic portion of the educational performance. For example, a student identified with an emotional disturbance or other social behavioral issues might perform above the 15th percentile in comparison to grade level peers because the individually administered, nationally normed test was given to them under optimal one-to-one conditions with minimal distractions. This performance in that optimal condition might be very markedly from what was seen in the classroom activities and assignments, as documented in their curriculum measures or the samples of the students' work. Or another student identified with an emotional disturbance, behavioral issues, or social or inappropriate skills might demonstrate significant anxiety or an outright refusal to participate in individually administered assessments, either due to the newness of the environment or the lack of rapport with the examiner. In those cases, their performance in the classroom would be above what you would see through just test scores themselves. The evaluation planning team is encouraged not only to review the test results, but to also identify the impact that functional performance factors have on the assessment results, and whether the impact demonstrates a greater or less adverse effect for the student outside of the assessment testing conditions. In reevaluations, a student eligible for special education is required by federal regulations to be reevaluated every 3 years to determine ongoing eligibility. Many schools and evaluation teams have historically taken appropriate measures to consider the current services, classroom supports, accommodations, and modifications in determining their impact on adverse effect. In this case, because the student is getting the appropriate level of support and assistance within the classroom, their grades, their classroom performance, their classroom behavior might look within standard limits within the classroom. And they may be doing quite well as far as their grades and their work is concerned, but it's only because they're getting those appropriate accommodations and modifications. If you took those away, we ask evaluation planning teams to consider where would that student be without that level of support? And without taking the support away to prove the case, we ask them to make a professional judgment. Would that student then be in the lowest 50th percentile of their class? Or would the student have some significant need that exceeds 85% of his classmates? For example, a student's classroom grades or performance may look as above the 15th percentile for their grade level peers. However, evidence may demonstrate that such grades are the result of consistent services, supports, and accommodations that, if withdrawn, would result in that student falling the lowest 50th percentile of their grade level peers. And then, like I say, in such cases, professional staff are asked to offer their judgment about the student's ability to meet classroom's expectations without that level of support and services. Parental input. Parents can also add to the functional performance discussion of the evaluation planning team meeting by providing either medical or psychological reports for the team's consideration. And the second one, reporting on a student's homework performance, not just the quality, quantity, length of time to complete a task, or the amount of adult supervision needed to complete the task, but over several opportunities. I think bringing in one sample of a student's performance or student's work from both sides, from either the school side or from the parent side, doesn't give you a clear picture. So I would think that bringing in 3 or 4 samples of a student's work is important to be able to say, and also say how the student did this work, how much assistance did they get in doing this type of work. Parents doing it at home may have samples of the student's work without the assistance of a paraeducator or a special educator, and therefore may have some real differences between samples of work done at school and samples of work done at home. What makes this difficult is the new guidance is a shift from a strictly numbers and testing driven decision to include information that is less objective, but every bit as important to the successful outcomes for students. Although there are tests that can measure functional behavior that can be employed by evaluators, it is the building of a case for adverse effect through either observation of the daily routine that best describes this effect on student performance. What needs to be gathered for evidence? Again, 3 different measures of school performance need to be documented for at least one basic skill area of concern. The 3 measures of school performance need to be for the same basic skill area. I can't take an achievement test in reading and math and written expression and say they're all in the lowest 15th percentile and say I've met the requirement for 3 different measures. That's the same measure of 3 different basic skills. And this is true for all the disability categories after age 6. There's no difference between the disability categories for adverse effect. Every one of the basic skills has to have this 3 measures of school performance. You're gonna have to forgive me. I'm running a cold here, and I have to take a drink. Otherwise, I'm gonna lose my voice. So, who are grade level peers? The comparison is not limited to just a single classroom, and we've heard that from districts before. He's not the lowest one in my classroom, but it really is not just a single classroom you're looking at, but you can include a look across different classrooms at the same grade level, or the expected school performance that's at grade level. In case you have, for example, if you have a advanced placement class in high school, the student may be in the lowest 15th percentile of that class, but in compared to his peers, is much higher than the 15th percentile. Functional performance is the acquisition of essential and critical skills needed for children with disabilities to learn specific daily living, personal, social, and employment skills, or the skills needed to increase performance and independence at work, in school, in the home, in the community, for leisure time, and for post-secondary and other lifelong learning opportunities. That is the definition of functional performance. It includes not just the academic, but also the functional piece of that in terms of educational performance. Functional performance may be described as the ability of the student to apply academic skills in a variety of ways or a variety of settings. Skills needed by students in order to live in society, such as independent living, community participation, communication, and employment. Skills and activities that may not be considered academic, but may be related to a student's educational performance. Functional is often used in the context of routine activities of everyday living, and are varied depending on the individual's needs of the student. The student's functional performance factors are such that either the frequency or number of services exceed those of 85% of their grade level peers and may mask potential adverse effect. Examples: behavior, refusal to comply, pragmatic skills such as eye contact, personal space issues, social language, and social skill deficits are all functional performance. Remember, the student's disability has already been established here. Therefore, functional performance is used to build a case for adverse effect, to begin a conversation about the effects of functional performance on student outcomes. Students in alternative placements may demonstrate appropriate skills, but they may not be able to demonstrate the same skills in a general education classroom. In addition, if your child is determined to have a disability, but adverse effect cannot be proven, the evaluation planning team is required to make a referral to your child's building principal. The building principal is then required to ensure a 504 team is convened to discuss whether a 504 plan is appropriate for your child. Here's an example of our state form for adverse effect. It begins with the listing of what the basic skill is that's being assessed. That's the list of the 9, listening comprehension, listening comprehension, oral expression, those 9 that I listed before. Then for each measure of school performance, they list both the data in the summary statement related to the impact of functional performance on the results. Here we have the 6 measures, and beside that is the column that talks about assessment tools for the results and discussion summary. So we've given them the opportunity here to not only list the test results, but to summarize how the functional performance affects those test results. And then for each measure of school performance, they indicate whether or not the student is in the lowest 15 percentile or -1 standard deviation or equivalent. And finally, for each measure of school performance, indicate if the team has determined there's sufficient evidence of an adverse effect. And finally, at the bottom, they document the team's conclusion for this particular basic skill area. So where are we going next? Vermont schools are collaborating to embrace a multi-tiered system of support for students who fall in that gray area, so that no matter what they need to access general curriculum, they will be supported, even if they're not eligible for special education services. The difficulty is that at this point, MTS is still emerging, and many districts are working toward implementing with fidelity. At this point in time, there is inequity across the state. As schools continue to make progress toward these eventual goals, efforts should continue to be made to make resources available for all students across our state, not just in special education, but also in the general education environment. So if you have additional questions, you certainly can ask by either calling or emailing myself and my 2 colleagues who work in the special ed division, Tanya Rutkowski and Cassandra Fleming. And I think now, if you'd like to type in questions, if you have additional questions, I'd certainly be willing to answer them. Or again, you can email me or call me at the number there. Now here's a question. The school says my child is so smart they wouldn't qualify. What should I do? I think in that case, that means that they have some evidence that your child is doing well, but you still suspect that a disability exists. I would request for a special education evaluation to determine if indeed there is something there. They're saying that the student is doing well is a predetermination. Really, the testing might show you something that they're not seeing at this point. So I would certainly recommend making the request. If indeed they're going to say no, they need to put that to you in writing. They need to say why they're saying no. And then you have the opportunity then to take that further to request a due process hearing to have someone determine whether or not it's okay to move forward with that evaluation. But indeed, if you request an evaluation from them, they either need to say yes or no, yes, and move forward with the evaluation, or if they're going to say no, put it in writing and say why they're saying no. Can you talk a little about what a parent can do if a school says your child won't meet adverse effect before ever doing an evaluation? Well, that's kind of what we were talking about. Schools shouldn't use that language. That language is making a predetermination before an evaluation is completed. They certainly can tell you what evidence they have to show that your child is doing well. and why they would consider not doing an evaluation at this time. But again, it comes down to, there may be something that they're missing that you're concerned about, and that discussion probably needs to happen then. Ernie, can you give us an example of proving adverse effect for written language with an emotional behavioral disturbance? What measures to use beyond achievement, grades, and work samples? Well, I think that's where we're getting at with the functional performance measures. What you're looking at is not necessarily a test score. You're looking at the behaviors of the student. You're looking at how they got the grades. You're looking at how they got the test scores. Again, a student who has an emotional behavioral disturbance may have difficulties in the classroom. But when you take him out to test him one-on-one, he shows you that he has potential by doing well in that optimal one-to-one conditions. And in that case, what you say is that he didn't meet the lowest 15th percentile in terms of his test scores, but certainly his functional behavior impedes him in such a way that in the classroom, he's not able to produce that same type of level work and is indeed significantly different from 85% of his peers. Please clarify how functional performance might keep a student eligible if some of the other criteria are not met. Well, indeed, that's it, is that it helps build the case for the student. Whether the student needs additional supports, additional special ed services, a different special education environment in order to perform at the level that is appropriate for them. Again, here we're talking about the level of severity. Certainly, if you've got a kid who's functioning in the 70th percentile in terms of his academics, but having difficulty in class, the question may be, what accommodations and modifications within the classroom might be appropriate? So the student may not qualify in terms of having an adverse effect, but may need a 504 plan to address some of the accommodations and modifications that they need within the classroom in order to show their appropriate level of work. What can a parent do if they disagree with the findings of the evaluation team? Certainly, you're entitled to an independent educational evaluation. At the end of the evaluation planning team process, you get an evaluation report. If indeed you disagree with that, there's a cover page on the front where it asks for your initials if you agree. You don't initial that, and you write a letter saying what you disagree to, and request an independent educational evaluation. The school district then has two choices: to agree with your request and give you a list of people in the area who do that type of testing, and it should be not on your dime, it should be on the district's time, or the district can request to have a due process hearing to have a hearing officer determine whether or not their evaluation was indeed comprehensive and complete. What can a parent do if the EPT doesn't seem to be taking into account the functional skills of a student with ASD or ED because academically the student is strong, but has no friends and frequent behavior outbursts, gets suspended frequently? I think in that case, you may be having to go to a due process hearing and have an impartial hearing officer hear all sides of the story, or you might go to mediation. And try to broker a deal with the district. But certainly, if they're not following procedure, that could also be an administrative complaint where they're refusing to look at the functional performance as part of the adverse effect decision. Here we've got one that says, my child refused to do the written portion of the triennial, so this section cannot be used for determining adverse effect on writing, which was a previous qualifier. This new rule seems to imply that refusal alone shows adverse effect. It could. It could show adverse effect. And indeed, what you want to do there is build the case by coupling it with grades in subjects where he's asked to do a lot of writing, such as English, or samples of his work, where it's not just in this case the quality of his work, but the quantity of his work. If everyone in the class is expected to write 6 paragraphs and he's only writing 2, that could be an evidence of an adverse effect. Can you explain how the independent evaluator is chosen? It really is the parent's choice, but it's typically based on a list of available evaluators that the school maintains. But if indeed there's not anyone local and you need to find a different evaluator and you find a different evaluator who has the proper qualifications, I would then check with the school to ensure that indeed this person has the right qualifications that's necessary for the evaluations that you're seeking. Due process isn't affordable for most parents. Do you have any advice on those who cannot afford an attorney? I would certainly recommend the Disability Law Project as one of the options. The other option might be trying mediation as an option also, which is certainly less costly than going to a due process. Let's see. My school changed my child from having a support person to being able to access one as needed. She really needs the one-on-one. What can I do? If indeed, the district makes a decision you don't agree with, you certainly are able to take that to a due process or ask for mediation.
Let's go back to these questions from Kim right here.
So here's a question that says, but we were talking about functional performance before, that you'd only get 2 measures, likely the grades and work samples. But I think you can speak to it, and also in terms of the how they scored on individual tests. I think you can speak to it as to how, what their classroom performance is, and how those scores were obtained. Again, if they were obtained under optimal conditions, it may prove it may give you a different story than what you see for the student in a classroom setting.
Did we answer this one here?
Yeah.
We answered that. Okay, let's go down to this one here.
If a student does well in testing and you prove your case because they don't do well in grades or samples that is just 2 measures, and even though it proves the case, is that going to meet adverse effect? If indeed you've got 2 measures that show he's in the lowest 15th percentile, you've got another one that conflicts with that, such as testing in a one-on-one situation, that's where you use the functional performance to say, again, under these optimal conditions, the student can perform above the 15th percentile. Then the question becomes, where does he best get his needs met? Or what accommodations and modifications are necessary for him to get his needs met? You could say that just with the proper accommodations and modifications in the classroom, the student wouldn't need specialized instruction or special education, in which case, then you would make a referral to the 5014.
This is more of a comment, high-functioning autism.
A student with high-functioning autism may score well on individual or even some group tests, but if ruled ineligible for special education, there's no recourse in due process where it is not determined or technically consistent with the regs. Well, again, it's a similar situation. It's proving the case. indeed, a student with high functioning autism may score very well on individual tests, but not do as well in the classroom. The question is, what is needed in the classroom in order to make that child successful? Would it require accommodations, modifications, or would it require additional staffing or support? Those are the questions. So whether or not it's a special ed question or a 5014 question is certainly up to the district at that point. If the disability is ED, is the team still required to show adverse effect, one of the 9 academic areas? What would be 3 measures of social anxiety impacting grades, like skipping class and getting 0? That certainly would be some evidence that the ED is affecting grades and probably work samples. Again, work samples could be that the student was expected to do 20 assignments that marking period, and he only did 9. Of the 9 he did quite well. So he shows, some quality of skills, but he doesn't show the quantity like he's expected to in the classroom. Is the agency available to provide technical assistance to evaluation planning teams that seem to be struggling to understand adverse effect? Yes, we are. We've also given, special ed administrators some tools to use with their staff in terms of training their staff. So, but we're also available to answer those questions. If a student goes to school with a strong MTS system, and so it's determined that they do not meet gate 3, which is the need for special education, what happens if they then move into an LEA that doesn't have as well developed an MTSS system? Again, it's a school by school decision. So a student who's in a strong MTS, multi-tiered system of support system, may not need special education because their needs can be met in the general education system through the supports available there. They may move to another school that doesn't have that system available and would need to be re-referred to their district special education team. Again, one of the questions here is, how do small schools prove lowest 15 percentile when you already have 1 or 2 intellectual disability in the class? In that case, it's not a single class that you're making comparison to. You're making comparison to over several classes or the general standard for that grade level. So it's not that the student is the lowest 15th percentile necessarily in that particular class, but for that particular grade level peer. And how do you prove that when you open that pool up? Again, by numbers. Where does this student fall, and what is expected of typical grade level peers for that grade level? MTSS, multi-tiered system of support, wouldn't prevent the student from being supported by a 504 plan. Is that correct? That is correct. A 504 plan could also augment an MTSS system of support. My school wants to wait before evaluating my child to see if the multi-tiered systems of support will meet his needs. How much time should I wait? Because they do periodic testing in the MTS system, I would certainly give them at least the time that they need between those assessments to have a baseline where the student is now and where they are after however many weeks it is until they do their next assessment. But if indeed they've got information on a weekly basis of how the student is doing, I would keep definite track of that and make the request. Schools can't delay just for the purpose of delaying. If indeed you feel that there's you suspect a disability, you should make that request and have them again either say yes or no, and if they're going to say no, they need to put that in writing and say why they're saying no. Are there any other questions that I haven't gotten to here? There's several here, and I probably what I'll do is take these questions back with me, and we'll make a little frequently asked questions, and I'll try to answer them and we'll attach them to the webinar.
So we don't see any other questions coming in. This is Janice Sabat from Vermont Family Network. So I wanted to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar. We're going to save this webinar on our website and also our YouTube channel. I encourage you to visit our website at vermontfamilynetwork.org. We have many, many different resources and fact sheets. We also list our upcoming webinars, so you can register for those. Keep in mind that our annual conference is going to be on April 3rd of next year at the Sheraton. We have a great keynote speaker lined up. And most importantly, if you ever want to talk to someone here at Vermont, we are parents ourselves. We welcome calls from families and professionals. We get all sorts of calls, and we are happy about that. So please give us a call at 1-800-800-4005 and have a good day.